she offered to save the dying passenger. They laughed at her medical expertise and refused her help. But 15 minutes later, nobody was laughing. But when the man's heart stopped beating at 39,000 feet and the cabin crew panicked, they discovered the woman they dismissed wasn't just offering to help. She was someone whose medical authority could mean the difference between life and death for Flight 892. Military surgeon Dr. Samantha Rodriguez settled into seat of Delta Flight 892 from Atlanta to Denver with the composed confidence of someone who had spent 22 years mastering trauma surgery and emergency medicine, rising from medical student to chief of trauma surgery at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, with comprehensive responsibility for overseeing surgical operations, trauma response protocols, and medical training programs that served military personnel worldwide through her expertise in combat surgery, emergency procedures, and life-saving techniques that had revolutionized battlefield medicine and saved thousands of lives. At 45 years old, she carried herself with medical authority earned through an MD from Johns Hopkins, advanced certifications in trauma surgery and emergency medicine, and comprehensive expertise in critical care that established new military medical standards through innovative surgical procedures, rapid response protocols, and training programs that consistently achieved the highest survival rates in military medical history. Her extraordinary credentials included performing over 3,000 trauma surgeries in combat zones, developing surgical techniques adopted across military hospitals worldwide, training hundreds of military surgeons in advanced life-saving procedures, and overseeing medical operations during critical missions where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death for wounded service members. Today's civilian flight was rare personal travel to visit family in Colorado. Though she dressed in simple business attire rather than military uniform, that typically identified her as one of the most respected medical authorities in military healthcare. Her deliberately civilian appearance reflected her preference for anonymity during personal time, rather than emphasizing military rank, allowing her to travel without the recognition that accompanied her distinguished medical career and military service. Flight attendant Jessica Martinez, a crew member with 4 years of commercial aviation experience who had developed assumptions about passenger medical qualifications based on appearance rather than actual credentials, observed Dr. Rodriguez's quiet demeanor without recognizing the extensive surgical expertise and military medical authority that characterized someone who regularly made life-or-death decisions under the most extreme circumstances in military combat medicine. When passenger Harold Stevens, a 63-year-old businessman, suddenly collapsed in the aisle of Flight 892 at 35,000 feet, clutching his chest and showing obvious signs of cardiac distress with shallow breathing and loss of consciousness, Dr. Rodriguez immediately recognized the critical nature of the medical emergency and moved from her seat to offer comprehensive medical assistance. But flight attendant Martinez quickly intercepted her approach with discriminatory medical exclusion that had become problematic in aviation, despite training programs promoting professional medical assistance from qualified passengers. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. This is a medical emergency requiring professional medical personnel," Martinez stated with obvious bias while observing Dr. Rodriguez's approach and making unfounded assumptions about her medical qualifications and authority to provide emergency medical care. "We have protocols for medical emergencies that require verification of medical credentials before allowing passenger medical intervention, and I need to contact ground medical support for professional guidance." Dr. Rodriguez immediately recognized the discriminatory nature of Martinez's response and clear violation of aviation. Medical emergency protocols that prioritized immediate life-saving care over bureaucratic verification, understanding that such medical exclusion could compromise patient survival during critical cardiac events. I am a trauma surgeon with extensive emergency medicine experience who can provide immediate medical assessment and life-saving intervention, Dr. Rodriguez replied with medical composure while observing the patient's deteriorating condition that required immediate professional attention. Cardiac emergencies require immediate medical intervention, and every second of delay increases the risk of permanent damage or death. Martinez continued her discriminatory approach with additional questioning about medical authorization that clearly exceeded appropriate emergency protocols and demonstrated systematic bias against medical expertise that Dr. Rodriguez had encountered throughout her career when her military rank wasn't immediately apparent to civilian personnel. As Martinez's discriminatory medical exclusion continued with additional restrictions on emergency intervention that clearly violated aviation medical protocols and demonstrated systematic bias against medical expertise, Dr. Rodriguez persisted in her professional assertions, while other passengers and crew members began witnessing the developing medical crisis and questioning the flight attendant's decision to reject qualified medical assistance during a potentially fatal cardiac emergency situation. I am formally requesting immediate medical intervention access and cessation of discriminatory exclusion procedures that violate established aviation medical emergency protocols, Dr. Rodriguez stated, with commanding medical authority and surgical expertise that should have immediately established her extensive familiarity with emergency medicine, trauma procedures, and the critical importance of immediate medical intervention during cardiac emergencies. Medical emergency protocols require comprehensive utilization of all available medical expertise and surgical knowledge without discriminatory exclusion based on assumptions that compromise patient survival and emergency response effectiveness. Martinez responded to Dr. Rodriguez's comprehensive medical assertions with increased exclusion and discriminatory obstruction, interpreting her extensive knowledge of medical procedures and emergency protocols as inappropriate interference rather than recognizing the obvious surgical expertise and medical authority that her responses demonstrated to anyone familiar with advanced medical training and emergency medicine protocols. Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but medical emergencies require coordination with our approved medical protocols and ground-based medical consultation, Martinez replied with obvious hostility that demonstrated complete ignorance about medical expertise, emergency intervention procedures, and the time-sensitive nature of cardiac emergencies that require immediate professional medical attention. Meanwhile, passenger Stevens's condition continued deteriorating as his breathing became more labored. His color turned ashen, and his pulse weakened, creating an increasingly critical situation that required immediate medical intervention, while other passengers began expressing concern about the rejection of medical assistance and the patient's obviously declining condition. Senior flight attendant Robert Chen, who had been observing the medical emergency with growing concern and recognition of Dr. Rodriguez's obvious medical knowledge and professional composure during the crisis, intervened to challenge Martinez's inappropriate exclusion and advocate for immediate medical assistance during the critical cardiac emergency. Senior flight attendant Chen immediately escalated his intervention to address the discriminatory medical exclusion and aviation safety violations that Martinez's approach represented, understanding that such bias could severely compromise passenger survival, delay critical medical intervention, and violate the inclusive medical assistance protocols that characterized effective aviation emergency response procedures. Flight Attendant Martinez, your exclusion of medical expertise during this critical cardiac emergency demonstrates misunderstanding about aviation medical protocols and emergency response procedures that prioritize passenger survival over administrative verification, Chen stated with Aviation Authority, and growing concern about medical bias that undermined professional emergency response and passenger safety. You are rejecting medical assistance from someone who possesses obvious advanced medical expertise, whose intervention could be crucial for saving this passenger's life and ensuring emergency medical response effectiveness. Dr. Rodriguez observed the professional intervention with medical satisfaction while continuing to monitor the patient's deteriorating condition and evaluate aviation medical protocols. Understanding that the situation represented a clear example of systematic bias that her medical advocacy had worked to eliminate throughout military and civilian medical emergency response procedures. Flight Attendant Chen, I appreciate your recognition of medical expertise, but this discriminatory exclusion represents significant institutional problems in aviation medical response that require comprehensive awareness and systematic accountability to ensure passenger survival and emergency medical effectiveness. Dr. Rodriguez explained with surgical authority and medical expertise that demonstrated her extensive experience addressing discrimination while prioritizing patient care and life-saving intervention. Medical bias and discriminatory exclusion undermine patient survival, compromise emergency response effectiveness, and violate the medical assistance protocols that should characterize all aviation medical emergencies and emergency response procedures. Other passengers and crew members began providing additional support for Dr. Rodriguez's medical expertise while expressing serious concern about the systematic nature of discriminatory medical exclusion that could significantly compromise passenger survival and violate the medical assistance protocols that should guide aviation emergency response operations. Cabin crew supervisor Captain David Wilson, who had been monitoring the medical emergency from the cockpit and becoming increasingly aware of the discriminatory medical exclusion and potential aviation safety consequences of rejecting qualified medical assistance during critical passenger medical emergencies, finally approached the emergency situation with aviation authority and institutional responsibility for ensuring passenger safety, medical excellence, and inclusive medical assistance protocols throughout commercial aviation emergency response operations. Flight Attendant Martinez, this medical exclusion clearly violates our aviation medical emergency protocols and appears to constitute discriminatory rejection of qualified medical assistance during a critical passenger medical emergency. Captain Wilson stated with Aviation Emergency Authority and growing medical safety awareness about inclusive medical assistance requirements and collaborative emergency response procedures that prioritize passenger survival over administrative verification and bureaucratic discrimination. All medical professionals and qualified medical personnel deserve immediate assistance access during aviation medical emergencies, regardless of assumptions about their medical credentials, because passenger survival requires comprehensive utilization of all available medical expertise and surgical knowledge. Dr. Rodriguez observed the aviation emergency intervention with professional satisfaction while continuing her medical monitoring and clinical assessment of the patient's critical condition. Understanding that the emergency highlighted critical issues about medical bias and the urgent need for comprehensive aviation medical training that recognizes medical expertise, surgical authority, and professional medical intervention protocols, while promoting inclusive excellence and passenger survival throughout commercial aviation medical emergency operations. Captain Wilson, I appreciate your intervention and commitment to aviation medical safety excellence, but this discriminatory medical exclusion represents systematic problems in emergency medical response that require ongoing medical awareness and comprehensive commitment to medical assistance and collaborative emergency response procedures. Dr. Rodriguez explained with surgical authority and medical expertise that demonstrated her extensive experience promoting medical safety and inclusive medical excellence throughout complex military and civilian medical emergency response operations. Captain Wilson attempted to address the situation through immediate medical protocol enforcement and medical assistance recovery. While growing increasingly concerned about the aviation's safety implications and potential regulatory consequences that the discriminatory medical exclusion had created for emergency response operations and passenger survival. Understanding the critical magnitude of aviation medical failures and potential regulatory consequences of continued discriminatory medical exclusion during passenger medical emergencies, Cabin Crew Supervisor Captain Wilson immediately implemented comprehensive medical protocol enhancement while recognizing the essential importance of maintaining collaborative relationships with medical professionals who determined emergency response effectiveness and passenger survival throughout commercial aviation medical operations and emergency medical procedures. Given the serious nature of these aviation medical violations and regulatory implications for our emergency medical response operations, I am implementing immediate medical assistance protocols and comprehensive medical procedure enhancement to ensure passenger survival and collaborative emergency medical response excellence, Captain Wilson announced with aviation medical authority and emergency responsibility while prioritizing medical assistance and surgical expertise over administrative hierarchy throughout the medical emergency response operations. Dr. Rodriguez accepted the aviation medical intervention and comprehensive medical assistance access while maintaining her surgical focus and patient medical monitoring. Understanding that the situation provided crucial insight into emergency medical protocols and aviation medical operations that significantly affected passenger survival, medical assistance procedures, and the collaborative medical excellence that should characterize all passenger medical emergencies throughout commercial aviation medical emergency response. Captain Wilson, I appreciate the immediate medical protocol enhancement and commitment to medical assistance excellence that prioritizes passenger survival and collaborative emergency medical response. Dr. Rodriguez stated with surgical authority and medical expertise while continuing her patient assessment and emergency medical coordination that demonstrated her medical knowledge and professional commitment to patient survival throughout complex medical emergency situations. Her medical composure and professional response to medical bias created positive recognition among aviation medical colleagues who understood that Dr. Rodriguez's medical handling of discriminatory exclusion exemplified the surgical expertise and medical emergency leadership that characterized successful medical emergency response and patient survival excellence throughout aviation medical operations. As the aviation medical assistance continued with enhanced emergency response protocols and medical collaboration procedures, Dr. Rodriguez began revealing the depth of her surgical expertise and comprehensive familiarity with trauma medicine operations that would soon completely transform everyone's understanding of her professional medical authority and surgical position within the military medical landscape and trauma surgery hierarchy that shapes modern emergency medicine and surgical excellence throughout the medical community. Captain Wilson, I want to ensure comprehensive understanding of the medical implications of collaborative emergency response and the medical standards that should characterize passenger medical emergency procedures and aviation medical operations. Dr. Rodriguez stated, with obvious surgical authority and medical expertise that demonstrated advanced knowledge of trauma medicine, emergency response coordination, and the systematic approaches necessary for effective medical emergency response throughout complex aviation medical operations and passenger medical emergency procedures. Emergency medical interactions and medical assistance protocols represent institutional relationships and medical partnerships that significantly affect patient survival, reputation, emergency medical coordination, and the professional medical standards that guide aviation medical operations and passenger survival throughout commercial aviation and medical emergency excellence. Captain Wilson observed Dr. Rodriguez's detailed medical knowledge and comprehensive surgical expertise with growing professional recognition that he was dealing with someone whose medical authority far exceeded typical passenger medical understanding and clearly suggested significant medical connection to trauma surgery, leadership, and medical emergency authorities at the highest levels of military medicine and trauma surgery operations. Dr. Rodriguez, your comprehensive understanding of medical operations and medical assistance protocols indicates extensive professional experience in trauma surgery and medical emergency leadership at the highest levels of military medicine. Captain Wilson replied with aviation medical recognition and growing awareness of Dr. Rodriguez's potential connection to major trauma surgery institutions and medical emergency leadership throughout the military medical community. Dr. Rodriguez smiled with surgical satisfaction while preparing to reveal the medical authority and trauma surgery leadership position that would completely transform the medical emergency situation and demonstrate the magnitude of surgical expertise and trauma medicine knowledge that had been systematically excluded through discriminatory medical assumptions and administrative bias. As Captain Wilson continued implementing comprehensive aviation medical protocols while recognizing the exceptional trauma surgery expertise and medical authority that Dr. Rodriguez demonstrated through her approach to emergency medical coordination and patient survival procedures, Dr. Rodriguez began revealing her actual position within the military medical landscape and the surgical authority that established her as one of the most influential trauma surgeons and medical emergency leaders in military medicine, trauma surgery, and medical emergency development throughout the military medical community and trauma surgery excellence. Captain Wilson, I think it's essential for comprehensive understanding that my medical interest in aviation medical excellence and emergency response procedures extends far beyond individual medical consultation experience or personal professional medical development, Dr. Rodriguez explained, with increasing surgical authority and trauma medical expertise that reflected her comprehensive understanding of medical systems and the complex medical coordination requirements necessary for effective trauma surgery leadership throughout large-scale military medical operations and trauma surgery excellence. I have comprehensive medical responsibility for trauma surgery operations and medical emergency standards that makes collaborative emergency medical response and medical assistance particularly important from both surgical perspective and medical emergency coordination throughout military medicine and trauma surgery excellence. Captain Wilson observed Dr. Rodriguez's sophisticated medical language and comprehensive surgical expertise with growing professional recognition that he was dealing with someone whose surgical authority went far beyond typical passenger medical knowledge, clearly suggesting significant medical connection to major military medical operations and trauma surgery leadership at the highest levels of military medicine and trauma surgery excellence. Dr. Rodriguez, your medical perspective and comprehensive trauma surgery knowledge suggest that you may have executive experience with major military medical operations and trauma surgery leadership at the highest levels of military medicine. Captain Wilson replied with aviation medical interest and growing medical awareness of Dr. Rodriguez's potential connection to major trauma surgery, administration, and medical emergency leadership throughout the military medical community. Dr. Rodriguez prepared to reveal her actual trauma surgery position and comprehensive surgical authority that would completely transform everyone's understanding of the medical emergency situation and demonstrate the extraordinary magnitude of surgical expertise that had been systematically excluded through discriminatory medical assumptions. The moment Dr. Rodriguez revealed her actual identity as Dr. Samantha Rodriguez, Chief of Trauma Surgery at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, with comprehensive responsibility for overseeing surgical operations, trauma response protocols, and medical training programs that served military personnel worldwide through her expertise in combat surgery, emergency procedures, and life-saving techniques that had revolutionized battlefield medicine and established trauma surgery standards adopted by military medical facilities globally, making her one of the most powerful trauma surgery executives and influential medical emergency leaders in military medicine, trauma surgery, and military medical development. The extraordinary scope of her surgical authority and military medical influence became undeniably apparent to everyone involved in the medical emergency, as they recognized that the discriminatory medical exclusion and systematic bias had been directed against one of the most important trauma surgeons and influential medical emergency leaders in the military medical landscape and trauma surgery community. Captain Wilson, Flight Attendant Martinez, and everyone witnessing this medical emergency, Dr. Rodriguez announced with full surgical authority and comprehensive medical emergency expertise, "I am Dr. Samantha Rodriguez, Chief of Trauma Surgery at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, with comprehensive responsibility for overseeing surgical operations, trauma response protocols, and medical training programs that serve military personnel worldwide through combat surgery, emergency procedures, and life-saving techniques that have revolutionized battlefield medicine and established trauma surgery standards adopted by military medical facilities throughout military medical operations." The revelation created immediate medical recognition and institutional understanding among all flight crew and passengers, who realized that they had been witnessing discriminatory medical exclusion directed toward one of the most powerful trauma surgery executives whose surgical decisions and medical emergency leadership directly affected trauma surgery protocols, emergency medical procedures, and patient survival throughout American military medicine and trauma surgery excellence. Cabin crew supervisor Captain Wilson stood with complete professional respect and medical reverence as he understood that the medical exclusion and discriminatory treatment had been experienced by the trauma surgery leader whose surgical authority and medical emergency expertise directly impacted trauma surgery protocols and emergency medical procedures throughout Walter Reed's military medical operations and trauma surgery excellence. Flight Attendant Martinez realized with complete professional horror that her discriminatory conduct and medical exclusion had been directed toward the Chief of Trauma Surgery at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. Understanding that her bias represented career-ending violations of aviation medical standards and the medical excellence that Dr. Rodriguez's surgical leadership had helped establish throughout military medicine and trauma surgery operations. This is why truth always comes to light, and justice always finds its way. If this story shows you that dignity and respect matter more than assumptions, make sure you subscribe to see more stories where justice prevails. Because when we stand together against discrimination, we make real change happen. Following the extraordinary revelation and undeniable demonstration of how discriminatory medical exclusion could compromise passenger survival and violate the medical assistance protocols that should characterize aviation medical emergency response, Delta Airlines immediately initiated comprehensive reforms to medical emergency training programs, medical assistance protocols, and discrimination prevention measures that would ensure systematic elimination of medical bias and comprehensive recognition of medical expertise throughout aviation operations and passenger medical emergency response procedures. Flight attendant Martinez was immediately enrolled in intensive professional development training and aviation medical education that would address her discriminatory assumptions, provide comprehensive understanding of medical expertise recognition, and ensure collaborative medical emergency response protocols for all medical professionals and trauma surgery specialists throughout commercial aviation medical operations. The passenger medical emergency was successfully resolved through Dr. Rodriguez's direct surgical intervention and trauma medicine expertise, preventing potential fatality and ensuring passenger survival through collaborative emergency medical response that demonstrated the critical importance of inclusive medical assistance and expert medical collaboration during aviation medical emergencies. The incident became a powerful catalyst for aviation industry discussions about medical bias and the essential importance of comprehensive emergency medical training that extended beyond administrative assumptions to include systematic recognition of surgical authority and trauma medicine expertise, ensuring optimal passenger survival and medical emergency protection throughout commercial aviation. Emergency medical response operations. Dr. Rodriguez's exceptional trauma surgery, leadership and professional response to discriminatory medical exclusion became a distinguished model for aviation. Medical excellence and inclusive medical collaboration. As her comprehensive approach to addressing bias was incorporated into military medical diversity programs and aviation medical initiatives that inspired other military medical organizations and aviation companies to strengthen medical recognition systems and eliminate discriminatory barriers throughout military medicine and trauma surgery excellence. Within weeks of the incident, Delta Airlines had implemented comprehensive new emergency medical protocols and medical assistance systems that would ensure effective recognition of trauma surgery expertise and eliminate discriminatory assumptions that undermined passenger survival throughout commercial aviation operations and medical emergency response procedures. But Dr. Rodriguez's story is just one example of how trauma surgery expertise meets medical discrimination. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and turn on notifications for new content. Don't forget to hit the like button if this story moved you, and share your thoughts and opinions about this situation in the comments below.